Yeah guys, in today's video we're going to talk about the final settings which I have to make to run this my AC coupled Powerwall with the new bad energy battery packs, and especially I will have a talk about balancing, because there is most of the confusion when it comes to lithium iron phosphate packs. And then as a conclusion to this video series, I will tell you what I have now finally paid for all of this equipment. So last time I ended by telling you how the communication is established between battery, BMS and the inverter. So what I then still had to do, you know, we are AC coupling on the grid input on the day hybrid inverter. I had to go to the generator port page again, and because now our references changed from battery voltage to percentage, I there had to make the change there with these SOC values at the microinverter inputs there. To make everything still working fine, I have set microinverters off at 100% and on at 99%. So this avoids the inverter going into some kind of strange mode, because it is trying to shut down microinverters and shift frequency, etc. Right? So another important change I had to do in the system work mode, and there on the page number 2, where it comes to the time of use, and here I have totally changed the battery strategy. You know, with my old battery, the battery was actually too small for my PV system here, so there was no issue to kind of charge the battery almost every day, right? But when you have a bigger battery, you have to make sure that that battery is also at least from time to time being charged up completely. And this is because of balancing. Right? We know that especially with lithium iron phosphate cells, we have this extremely extended period of time within the charging curve. But it's almost about 85% of the total time of charging, where the curve is extremely flat. So there's not much voltage difference when it comes to differences in state of charge. And this is a big problem for balancing. And it doesn't matter what kind of balancer you have, active or passive, within that area, no balancer will do a good job, and it's also not necessary to activate a balancer in that area, right? So when do we want to balance, or when can we balance? Balancing is as well actually only done at the top of the voltage curve, so we are top balancing. So we need to wait until we come out of the flat area, and then when it goes into this final part of the charging, when the voltages are rising rather quickly, then there we can then activate our balancers and they can do their job, right? But for that, of course, you have to make sure that your battery is also getting charged up. So if your battery strategy here in the time of use table is that you just keep your target state of charge value somewhere on the down, and you're just waiting for excess energy to charge into the battery, but when there's no excess, the battery would then right away be discharged again. So at the end of the day, you have never reached a full state of charge. At that day, you would also not have balanced. That might not be a problem if it's only a few days in a week, let's say on weekend, when the energy demand is higher. But at least, let's say, half of the days a week, you should still reach a full battery charge, so that the balancer can also do some job sometime. And this, I make sure that I have a period here in the table where I demand that the battery state of charge is, if there's energy of course available from the PV system, that it tries to reach at least 100%. And it's good to at least at the end of the day remain for, let's say, 30 minutes or 1 hour at that full state of charge, to give the balancer time to do some job. Active balancers do have the advantage that they are then a little bit faster, but these base BMSs with the passive balancer, they also work quite well. I have one in the system in the garage, and it does its job also very well there. Yeah, and this is where I have to interrupt the video. I just told you that in my system in the garage, where I do have also a battery with a base BMS installed, that one is a 100 ampere version. There everything works fine and exactly as I want. But in the new system, unfortunately, it's not like that. And what the problem is, I will tell you in a moment. But we have to understand all this matter, dive a little bit, unfortunately, into theory, and let me just tell you exactly how all this topic with batteries, inverters, communication, etc. is working. So there are essentially two concepts how a battery is charged and discharged. The traditional concept is where the inverter, or you can also just say a charge controller, is forcing the battery, and the BMS, which is built into the battery, is just supervising the limits, and once a limit would be breached, then the BMS would discontinue the operation, which normally, if the settings on the inverter or the charge controller is right, would never happen. So the inverter is controlling voltage and current and charging or discharging the battery. And then we have the latest concept with the so-called inverter BMSs, where the battery controls the inverter. So this is working by the BMS communicating its parameters, which are set there, to the inverter. This is happening by a communications protocol. Now let's look quickly into those two concepts. So in concept one, the inverter is forcing the battery. The battery is not really resisting to anything. The inverter is just giving charge or taking charge, and that's it. The advantages of this concept is that it is the perfect fallback method. It is always working as long as you stay within the limits. The BMS will keep the doors open, so to say, and the inverter charge controller can do whatever it wants with the battery. The second advantage is it is using the proven method of CCCV. That means constant current and then constant voltage. Right? The current will be reduced in that way, voltage will be then kept constant. Disadvantages of this method might be that it requires some experience, because you need to know what exactly you are setting in your inverter, and the BMS does not have to intervene and stop whatever you are doing. The other thing is, of course, that the wiring between your inverter and battery is affecting the system behavior. All the wiring is adding up resistances, and those will affect currents and voltages, voltage drops. So your CCCV method will be affected by those resistances there. Let's see the other concept where the battery controls the inverter. So this is the newest way how we do this. Advantages there is you can make use of new smart BMS features. So these new inverter BMSs, they can of course do much more than protect, monitor, balance. They can as well also keep track of the battery health, cycles, etc. These new features typically will require a connection and communication with the inverter. The second advantage is that you can have a better system performance at the edges. So when in the other method the inverter would reach a constant voltage phase, this will start reducing your output current or input current, while when the inverter is controlled by the BMS, this will be just like clear cutoffs, right? So you will run into that limit and bang, the BMS will just cut out. So there's no transition phase there at the edges. Then parameters can be set also by the manufacturers. So if they get it right, the user might not have to set anything in the BMS anymore or at the inverter, because BMS and inverter are exchanging the information and setting it there. Disadvantages are that, of course, this requires compatibility among all involved. So the BMS must be compatible with the inverter by using correct protocols, etc. If this is not compatible, your equipment will not work or not be able to communicate. And it can also cause more confusion to the end user, because it is not understandable anymore by physics like the other method. This is just pure settings, and if you don't understand some settings, you might just run into total confusion here. So if we look at the final picture, we have the three parties which are involved. We have the BMS maker, inverter maker, and the battery maker. Between the BMS maker and the inverter maker, they must use or define a suitable protocol which uses all available parameters, right? If I have 50 parameters in a BMS and the inverter can only use 40 of them, this is not ideal, of course. Between the BMS maker and battery maker, they can preset some useful parameters to avoid users then to go on a search for the correct parameters. And they need to work out the firmware which suits to the product. So this must all fit together there. The battery maker, inverter maker, they should make sure that their equipment is actually then compatible and working together without causing any problems. So now, what is the problem with my system? And the problem there is that the pace BMS and the day hybrid inverter, they do not work together as they should, ideally. When you have a big powerful system like this, you also have really high charge currents, for example. And when you are in the communication mode between BMS and inverter, as I told you before, that charging operation will actually not be interrupted until the very end. So in this case, in my case, the day inverter does not understand or use a very important parameter of the pace BMS, and that is the peak full voltage, which would actually tell the inverter which voltage it should use as a sort of absorption voltage, so that at the end the CV phase is entered before the voltages are starting to race towards the overvoltage protection, and then reduce the current slowly so that the balancer at the end has a chance to stay on for a while. Because this is the next big problem, this time by the pace BMS. This BMS does only balance while it is charging. I don't know if this is a flaw or just a bad design, but it is really a bad idea. Because if you only allow balancing during charging, you are missing out on a very important time frame, and that is when the battery is full and individual cell voltages might be on the high side. Once the charging is done and you stop balancing, you're missing out on that time where you could further on continue and balance those high cells, draw the voltages down. Now, if there is also no way to slow down the charging, that period of balancing where you tell the balancers to start until over voltage protection, which is then ending the whole charging process, may only take minutes, right? Now there is a lucky circumstance with the day inverter. It understands another command, and that one is that for the overvoltage alarm, which comes before the overvoltage protection, with that value you can actually force the inverter to reduce its output current. This works very well in my garage because the output current after the alarm is only 1.7 amps. But on the system here at the Powerwall, the output current is unfortunately still 36 amps. It's of course much less than it would be 100 or 120 amps, but if you split that to the two batteries, you still have 18 amps per battery of final current. And 18 amps is still much too high, right? It doesn't matter if this is now the passive balancer with just a few milliamps or an active balancer with 2 amps. It is still overpowered very much by the inverter. So the maximum time of balancing, even if you set that alarm voltage very low, so right after you start balancing, let's say 3.41 volt, and then you already put the alarm voltage at 3.42 volts, it would only give you around 10 minutes of balancing time, which is more or less nothing, right? And for that, it would be extremely important to extend the balancing time into the time when the inverter is then only idling and charging is finished. So is there a way for us to counteract this situation? And there is. So what I had to do is I had to go to the fallback procedure, which is inverter is forcing the battery. This is when you go to the battery settings in the day inverter, and instead of using lithium mode, you go to the use voltage mode, right? Because then it is again just a simple charge controller where you can set your absorption voltage, your floating voltage. So when you then set your absorption voltage at a value where the batteries will start balancing and then the current is reduced, you can give the balancer precious time to do its job. Right, so I have set an absorption voltage of 55 volts, and after that a floating voltage of 55.1 volts. So when absorption is done, it will jump into floating. This will keep a very low current and the balancer will be active, and instead of only having like 8 or 10 minutes of balancing time, you can have almost 1 hour, because the charging is then still not interrupted until the charge current is really reaching zero. When it reaches zero, then the balancer will stop balancing. But still also then, if the pack drops a little bit in voltage again and then restarts charging, then still again the balancer will come on, because only the overvoltage protection, if that one is reached, that one will completely then discontinue the balancer. So in this case here, when we are just floating, every time when there is a little bit of charge current, the balancers will then still again kick in. So this is of course making the idea of the inverter BMS obsolete, right? But what shall we do? This is, I have researched the forums and YouTube videos, etc. You can find a lot of problems which are mostly talking about BMSs and their inverters. So there seem to be most of the troubles there. I also found, for example, a video of Andy Off-Grid Garage, where he was speaking really good about these PACE BMS, the same ones which are built here in these packs. He has a Victron inverter, and the Victron inverter with its protocols is understanding all the parameters, required parameters, and it's doing the absorption there, and so it is working very well. But unfortunately they has chosen to use an existing protocol from Pylontech, and there seems to be some gaps, and it does unfortunately not understand those parameters which would be really very important in this case. But still, the biggest problem is that the PACE BMS does not continue balancing when the pack is full, because if that would continue, then it really does not matter much how quickly charging is discontinued, because then it would later on have time enough to draw down all the high cells as well. So yeah, so all these balancing setups and limitation setups are then quite similar to any other BMS. You are just protecting so that the cell voltages are not too high, not too low, and you activate a balancer. This I can show you here. I have set 3.4 volts as the balancing starting voltage and 20 millivolts for the cell difference. But everything else, as I said, would be quite similar to any other BMS then. I have again pulled that combination, which is the least favorable as it seems. But you can see PACE BMS actually does have more than 20 communication protocols from many different inverter brands, and I'm assuming that those brands which do have their own protocol, that they really use all the spectrum of parameters the BMS can provide, and that these inverter and BMS combinations will work much better when it comes to communications. So the only thing I can wish for is that PACE and they are sitting down on a table together and work out a protocol which works. There is already a very big inverter manufacturer, so they could really use this opportunity and to work out something, because I cannot imagine that those inverters cannot accept readings of a charge voltage or anything like this and store it in their memory there. The battery manufacturer is the unfortunate third in this group here, of course, now, because the only thing what they can do is choose a BMS, and in this case, of course, they also don't know which combination of equipment their customers are going for. So some will not experience any kind of problems, some will experience problems in me. But for them, it could be just the only way to choose maybe another BMS for their product, or make that optional. Ask the customer, do you want a PACE BMS inside, or do you want, for example, a GK BMS with an active balancer on it? I have spoken to Jason, and he said, you know, they are OEMs, they can build whatever is required or requested. So for them, it does not make a difference if they use a PACE BMS or if they use a GK BMS or a DALI or whatever inverter BMSs are out there. Yeah, so it would be great if we maybe also get some feedback. What sort of combination do you have? If you have a battery with an inverter BMS, which BMS do you have? Which inverter do you have? Do you have any sort of problems? Do you have also challenges balancing your pack? Let us just please know in the comment section. Maybe we can even help to improve equipment here. I wanna jump back into the old recording where it comes to the costs of the system. I promised you to tell you what I have now finally paid for this system. So you remember when we have ordered the inverter, for that one I have paid around $1,750 including shipping. The batteries now, also including shipping, have been around $1,450. And then I have spent extra $100 for cabling. Yeah, so in total this is around $4,750, which I think for a system like this, which is very capable, right? We have 10 kilowatts here on the inverter side and 32 kilowatt hours on battery side. I think that is very, very competitive and a good price, and this will even pay off, right? So with this system I'm expecting to remove around 7 megawatt hours, so 7,000 kilowatt hours of energy a year. That has a value here in Thailand of around 1,000 US dollars per year. So this system would actually pay off within 5 years. But I have now a debt coming from the old Powerwall. That one has only paid off half because of my constantly failing inverters there and the very quickly degrading second-hand cells. So that loss from the version 1 AC-Powerwall into the version 2 AC-Powerwall. So, but at the end, I think in around 7 to 8 years, also my battery system will actually have paid off. Please watch the videos of this series which you did not see until now. For those of you who have followed the whole process, I hope you found it interesting. I want to thank you for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe to the channel, and I will keep you informed whatever is happening here on the system. I see you next time.